Hey, welcome everyone to the fall Judaic Studies lecture. We're very happy to have for the second time, we see it there, Azzan Yadin-Israel. He was here last time to speak about his book on the theology of Bruce Springsteen, which it's a real topic and a very interesting topic. But subsequent to that, he wrote a book. And there it is, and he's going to speak about it, Forbidden Fruit, A Mystery Solved. All of you, all the students, you have to take theology. It means you all study the Bible. And I have to say, from doing it now a number of years, almost exclusively students assume that the fruit is an apple. You know, Adam and Eve ate the apple. So, and then you see, well, you look long and hard, you won't find the apple. So how is the fruit an apple? To that, we give you our speaker who's going to talk about this, solve this mystery. He'll speak, he tells me, for around 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions. So without any further ado, I call on Azzan.
Can you? All right, wonderful. Good evening. First of all, thank you to Professor Shapiro and to Scranton for this invitation, and thank you for being here. What I'm going to talk to you about this evening is taken from this book right here, Temptation Transformed, the story of how the forbidden fruit became an apple, in which I try to offer an explanation to this question: if the apple is not, you say it's force of habit, if the fruit, the forbidden fruit is not an apple in the Bible, when did it become an apple, and why did the apple, of all the fruit, all the potential fruit, become such a dominant forbidden fruit? In other words, so absolutely identified with forbidden fruit. I'm going to touch on 4 topics. The first is the absence of the apple in ancient sources. Then a section called the bad apple, in which I'm going to introduce the theme that has become the dominant explanation for why the forbidden fruit is an apple, which I don't think is correct, but that's what I'm going to have to present to you. A section on the art of the forbidden fruit, and finally, what I take to be the true historical explanation of the shift to the apple, and that has to do with early European vernaculars, the spoken languages of Europe. Okay? So starting with the absence of the apple. This is a very short section because I just have to show the apple is absent, but it is absent in the book of Genesis. In the book of Genesis, the Hebrew word that is used is pli, which is a generic term for fruit. It's not specified what kind of fruit. The same is true in the Septuagint, the Greek translation to the Bible. Kailabusa tu karpou tu ephagen, taking its fruit. Karpos, the Greek word for fruit in general, not a specific fruit, she ate. Ditto with Latin, where the word is fructus. You can see it here, which is basically, the word fruit, or the source of the English word fruit. You have this both in the early Latin, the Vetus Latina, and in the Vulgate, which became like the dominant medieval Christian Bible. So it's not in the Bible or its translations. There are no apples there. And interestingly, the question of the identity of the forbidden fruit occupied early commentators. So here we have a text from early Jewish commentators from the rabbinic tradition, Bereshit Rabbah or Genesis Rabbah. What was the forbidden fruit is the question that they are debating. And this paragraph basically collects a series of answers that are given in different sources in early rabbinic literature. So Rabbi Meir says the wheat, Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai says grapes, Rabbi Abba of Akko says the citron, Rabbi Yosef says figs, and then we have this very long tradition that says the Holy One, blessed be He, did not reveal the tree to anyone and will not do so in the future. It's a mystery. So There are two things that I want to point out here. One is that clearly the rabbis don't have any single tradition. They don't have like an answer to this. There are various answers. Some of them are actually going to end up being pretty prominent in later medieval sources. They're going to be a lot of, you'll see like artwork, a lot of artwork that identifies the forbidden fruit as a fig. There's a lot that identifies as a grape, but there's no unanimity. The second interesting point is that even though they have these candidates, no one suggests the apple. So they have this rabbi says this rabbi says that. Nobody says the apple. They've never heard of that tradition. The same is true in early Christian, among early Christian commentators. This is the commentary on Genesis by Origen. It was an important Origen of Alexandria, who wrote in Greek. He's commenting on Noah after the flood. After the flood in Genesis 9, the waters recede. Noah and his family come out of the ark, and Noah plants a vineyard. That ends up, not going that well. But for our purposes, the key point is that this verse, Genesis 9:20, Noah was the first to plant a vineyard. Origen says, such was the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In other words, the fruit of knowledge of good and evil was a grapevine. Now, why a grapevine? Well, basically because there is a long tradition of sin. I don't know if I should say this on a college campus, but there's a long connection between sin and alcohol. Okay? Just heads up. Be good, all right? Long tradition of sin and alcohol, and because of that, and because of certain biblical verses, that becomes understood as the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And the fig, which we saw earlier, also has some biblical grounding. After Adam and Eve eat the forbidden fruit, they realize they're naked, and they immediately cover themselves with fig leaves. What can we maybe learn from that? Well, maybe they were standing next to a fig tree because that was the tree of knowledge. It's not stated in the Bible, it's not really explicit, but if you're looking for some biblical explanation for what the forbidden fruit was, at least you have something there. At least there's some connection. The apple has none of these. Okay? So, not in the Bible, not in the early translations. The apple is not known to early rabbinic commentators, not known to early Christian commentators. So, where did it come from? The standard explanation of this phenomenon has to do with the Latin word for apple. The Latin word for apple is malum, and malum is also, or the homonym, is evil, an evil thing, or the adjective evil. We have that in English, malevolent, the mal of malevolent, or of malice. Thank you. All of those are from this Latin word malum, meaning bad or evil. So this is a pretty plausible explanation. If the argument goes, if in Christian theology the forbidden fruit brought about the fall of man, the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, the introduction of death into the world, right? What terrible theological malum that is, what an evil that is. What is a more appropriate fruit than the malum, the apple, right? Everyone see the logic of that argument? That's the standard argument. You'll find this in 1,000 books about the book of Genesis, about the forbidden fruit. This is completely standard. Okay, and this is the argument that I need to first dispense with and then try to show what I take to be the correct argument. So the first problem with this argument is that if you read through the Latin commentaries and the Latin discussions on the fall of man, on Genesis 3, you will see that the Latin authors do not use the word malum when they're talking about the forbidden fruit. They do use the word fructus. We saw that in the Vulgate earlier, when I was showing the slides. They use a Latin word called the Latin word cibus, which is generally like a generic term for food. And the most common word they use is pomum. And that appears, you can see here in Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, in very, very popular tellings of the fall of man, like the life of Adam and Eve, which was this popular text that retold the story of the Bible, spread throughout Europe, translated into a dozen languages. But in the Latin original, they used the word pomum to the point where there emerged these phrases, pomum interdictum, pomum prohibitum, pomum vetitum, all of which mean the forbidden fruit. So the idea that the malum, the Latin word malum, meaning both evil and apple, that's the foundation for how we came to think of the apple as the forbidden fruit, that's a huge problem. If they're not using that term, if the Latin authors aren't using that term, then there's no play on words, right? There's no place for this to come about. Instead, they're using those words, particularly pomum. I'm just going to give you one example of, or one slide with two texts where you might expect the Latin authors to use the word malum, but they don't. So these are both of these authors, Philip of Hauvent and Alan of Lille, are Cistercians. They belong to the Cistercian order. And they're both writing in Latin. They're both living in what we today would call France. They're both French, but they are writing in Latin. And even if you don't know Latin, which was not a requirement for this lecture, hopefully you can see that the phrase, the first woman who desired the forbidden fruit that contains evil, that the author says the forbidden fruit is pomum, vetitum, pomum, the word we saw on the previous slide, that contains malum. That's where it says male continens. If you're going to make a pun about malum, this would be a great place to do it. The fruit that contains evil, you would say the malum that contains malum, something like that. But he doesn't. He uses pomum. Same thing with Alan of Lille. Only by the prohibition of God was it bad, malum, to eat the fruit, pomum. If you want to make this pun, if this is going to be your argument, why we associate the fruit with the apple, well, he should have done it. He should have said that it became malum to eat the malum. But he doesn't. And in fact, basically no one does. I spent about a year combing through. There are a lot of Latin commentaries on Genesis and a lot of discussions. And I found one place where there might be this pun, but it never took off. It's like this one Spanish author who maybe makes this pun, but that's it. No one else. So we are at a dead end in terms of the malum having to do with the book of Genesis. Okay? How are we doing? So far so good? I just want, it's a fair amount of material, and we've just covered the first 1,000 years, so I just want to make sure we're all still together. All right? There is another biblical verse that is used as the basis for this argument, for this malum malum argument, and it occurs in the Song of Songs. The Song of Songs 8:5. Under the apple tree I raised thee up, there thy mother was corrupted. That is the translation that is based on the Latin, not what the Hebrew actually says, but it doesn't matter. We're looking at how the medieval authors understood this. So under the apple tree, it says sub arbore malo, which could be read as under the apple tree or under the evil tree, more or less. If we understand the Song of Songs in an allegorical way, in some sense, which is how it was read in the Middle Ages, then the phrase, there your mother was corrupted, could refer to the mother of humanity, Eve, and you would say Eve was corrupted under an apple tree. Under the apple tree, your mother was corrupted. The mother of humanity was corrupted. Okay, so this is another verse that people today say, look, this is why we think of the forbidden fruit as an apple. Because you have this verse, Song of Songs 8:5, that says, under the apple tree, there your mother, the mother of humanity, was corrupted. So the ancient readers or the medieval readers saw this verse and they made that connection and said, the apple tree was the tree of knowledge. The forbidden fruit came from the apple. No good. It's lovely, but it's not good. And I'll tell you why. Because this is not the first place the apple appears in the Song of Songs. The Song of Songs in chapter 2, verse 3, has the woman, the beloved, saying, as the apple tree among the trees of the woods, so is my beloved among the sons. My beloved, my lover is like, among other men, like the apple tree among the tree of the woods. Now, I just mentioned that the Song of Songs was generally interpreted allegorically. If you read it in its literal sense, it's a love poem, a pretty erotic love poem, where the man and the woman are often praising each other's beauty. But that's not how medieval commentators generally understood it. They understood it as an allegory. For Jewish readers, it was an allegory between God and the nation of Israel. For Christian readers, it was an allegory of Christ and the church. If we read it in those terms, then the church is praising Christ as the apple tree. As the apple tree among the trees of the woods, so is my beloved. And this is in fact exactly how it was interpreted. Martin of Lyon writes, here's his commentary, under the apple tree I raised you up. That's the verse we saw from 8:5. Under the apple. The apple tree represents nothing other than the sacred cross, like the wood of the tree is like the wood of the cross, that sustains that very apple, namely Christ, concerning whom the same bride, the sacred church, says, like an apple tree among the trees of the forest, so is my beloved among sons. Martin of Lyon, and this is one example of many. I couldn't bring them all because I was told we have to finish before 11. So this is one example of many of Christian interpreters understanding the fruit of the apple tree to be Christ, like Christ on the cross, is like the apple on the apple tree. In other words, this is not a verse that is going to lead us to the cause of sin. For these Christian interpreters, the apple is salvation, right? The apple tree is, the apple is the salvation. The apple is Christ. So this is not going to be the source of thinking about the apple as the forbidden fruit, as the fruit that leads to sin. Okay, I'm pausing again. How's everyone doing? We've seen two arguments in favor of the malum hypothesis. One is that this is just like built into the idea of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So the evil is malum, and therefore it's like an apple tree. But in fact, that's not the name that they use in Latin to talk about the forbidden fruit, and it doesn't appear in the commentaries. The second argument is from the Song of Songs. The verses that are up here, under the apple tree I lifted you up, there your mother was corrupted. But that doesn't work either, because the apple tree is likened to Christ in the allegorical reading, not to sin. So both of those arguments fall flat. All right. As a result, if we look at Andrew of St. Victor, who is probably the most learned and important Christian Bible commentator of the 12th century, he writes in his commentary, they sowed fig leaves. I just mentioned, this is right after Adam and Eve eat the forbidden fruit. They realize they're naked, and they cover themselves with fig leaves. And he says, some say that the forbidden fruit was a fig, and he gives this verse as the source. Some say it was a vine because of Jeremiah 31:29. It doesn't matter the details of this interpretation. But the point is, as he's interpreting in the 12th century, he knows of two dominant interpretations: the fig and the vine. What does he not know? No apple. There's no apple. So basically, in the 12th century, the greatest commentator, the most learned commentator in the Christian world doesn't even know that there's an apple tradition. All right? So in a certain sense, the texts have led us into a dead end. We know that the forbidden fruit becomes an apple. We know because we know the end of the story. We know this reality. Everyone knows the forbidden fruit's an apple. But the texts don't give us an explanation of why that is or how that came about. So we try a different direction. We look at the representation of the forbidden fruit in art. Okay? And that's what we're going to do now. I'm just going to give you a very brief guided tour through basically the iconography of the forbidden fruit, starting really the earliest Christian art in any meaningful sense is in Rome. These are late 3rd or early 4th century murals from catacombs, from the underground burials of Rome. And not all of them are easily identified, and some of them may not be identifiable. It's not that every artist necessarily used a realistic tree, but many of them can be seen to be figs. The fig leaf is very wide, so it's relatively easy to identify. You can see the fig leaf here as well, and in fact, Eve is plucking a fig. You can see the little fig in her hand. And this is more Roman art. This is the Junius Bassus sarcophagus. In other words, a burial, like a burial marble. It's a little hard to see here, but if you zoom in right above Adam's head, you can see the outlines of the fig leaf. Right. Not all of them are figs. I don't want to overstate the case, but for my purposes, it doesn't matter if they're all figs or not. I just want to show that they're not apples. So here you see, this is from Toulouse in France, the tomb of St. Clair. Eve is holding some large round apple, some large round fruit. Not clear what it is, not necessarily an apple. This is Carolingian. This is from Tours. So Charlemagne establishes a very important center of Christian Bible manuscripts, of illuminated manuscript, brings artists from all over Europe to create these beautiful Bibles. And you can see here, Eve is plucking a fig. You see the fig leaves. By the way, these are two scenes. You have to read this 9th century image like the way you'd read a comic book. A graphic novel. I'm dating myself. So this is Eve plucking the fruit, and this is Eve giving Adam the fruit to eat. Okay, but you can see clearly the fig leaves here, to me, unidentifiable fruit, tiny little red fruit. I don't know what that is, but it's certainly not the apple. So the early Christian art has largely figs and then some other or unidentified fruit. If we start zooming into specific regions, we find something interesting. So in France, we have figs. These might be a little hard to see in this resolution, but those are fig leaves right there. We also find other fruit, such as the grapevine. Right? I hope you can see this. She's holding a grapevine in her hand. Interestingly, in the same basilica in Vézelay, France, there is another column whose capital has Eve giving Adam a pomegranate. Right? You can see the crowns, the corona of the pomegranate. Clearly, the church itself had no problem with two different depictions of the forbidden fruit. The forbidden fruit in one room is grapes, in another it's the pomegranate. No one is troubled by this. You have some unidentified round fruit in some images, but in the 12th century, we do find, as far as I can tell, for the first time, an apple. As far as I can tell, this is the first image of the forbidden fruit as an apple in this 12th century abbey. And once it appears in the 12th century, the fruit takes off. It becomes the go-to forbidden fruit and basically starts to marginalize the other fruit. It becomes dominant and almost exclusive. Here's Eve giving Adam a red apple, and here's a great picture. Eve giving Adam a bitten apple. Right? You see the white middle. She's already bitten it, and she's giving him the opportunity to share in this sin. This is from the 13th century. Other 13th century, on and on, apples, apples, apples. There is an interesting exception that has nothing to do with my talk, but it's kind of too cool not to include here, which is the forbidden fruit as a mango. That's just someone outside, right? Okay. It sounds like a program or something. Here's the forbidden fruit as a mango. Late 15th century, early 16th century, precisely when Portuguese traders began importing mangoes to Europe from India. So our artist had a mango, saw a mango, thought, oh my goodness, this may be the forbidden fruit. You know, it's coming from some far off land, it's tempting, it's sweet, so they included it. But generally, the apple appears in the 12th century and very quickly becomes the dominant forbidden fruit. If we look at Germany and the lowlands, and by the way, this is what I'm going to say is true of England as well, we're going to see a similar dynamic. Early on, fig, you can see the large fig leaves. In the 12th century, maybe or early 13th, maybe an apple, not, or some red fruit. Pomegranates are floating around in some representations, but by the 13th and 14th century, it's just apples, apples, apples. Here you have images from what's called the Northern Renaissance. Hieronymus Bosch, clearly an apple. Hugo van der Goes, apple. He's Dutch. And Albrecht Dürer has two very famous images, Adam and Eve is holding an apple in her left hand, and this is also by Dürer, currently in the Prado in Madrid, of Eve holding the forbidden fruit. So right now we have at least a little bit of historical context. We don't have an answer to why this happens, but at least we have a place and a time where it starts, and what appears to be some pattern of diffusion or promulgation. It starts in 12th century France, and then it spreads out to Germany, England, and the Netherlands. Okay? We look at Italy, we're ready for basically the same dynamic. It should be more of the same, presumably. And we start out with the figs. These are also figs. You see the fig leaf by the hand. I'm not sure what this is. It's just another round fruit. But again, figs. Now it's 14th century, and we're still looking at a fig tree. You can see the fig leaves by Adam's head, a very clear fig leaf. Maybe a golden apple in Padua, which is way up in the north. But in Venice, again, 15th century, and it's figs. And figs. And even in the Renaissance. This is an image by Raphael, which is a fig tree. You can see Eve's hand and the leaves above. Another image by Raphael, which actually doesn't have anything. The most famous image of the fall of man is the Sistine Chapel, and again, it's a fig, right? You see the fig leaves. You can actually see the fig in Satan's hand or the serpent's hand. It isn't until the middle of the 16th century that we begin to get figs in Italy. We begin to get apples in Italy. And here, Titian, you have, again, an apple. So now we have this weird incongruity. We don't know why exactly, but the apple did appear in 12th century France. It spread pretty quickly to England, Germany, the Low Countries. But it didn't spread to Italy. Italy continues representing the forbidden fruit as a fig. So we have three questions that any explanation here needs to answer. First of all, why did the fruit appear when and where it did? Second, why did it disperse the way it did? Why was it promulgated the way it did? Right, that irregular shift very quickly in Germany, England, and the Low Countries, but much more slowly, much later in Italy, and the same thing is true of Spain. And the third question is, why did it completely dominate all the other fruit? I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of years in which the forbidden fruit is represented as a fig or as a pomegranate or as a grape cluster. You know, and they all kind of live together. Suddenly it becomes an apple monoculture. Suddenly it's only apples and nothing else. And why would that happen? Okay? Those are the questions we need to answer. How do we answer this? Well, I'll tell you how we don't answer this first of all. We don't answer this by looking at religious sources. There's a very, very strong tendency in religious studies, broadly speaking, the study of religious traditions, to assume that changes occur within the understanding of religious traditions from within. That there's some theological innovation or there's some change that comes about in the interpretation of the verse, something like that. I don't believe that that's the issue here. I don't believe that that's what's happening here. This is a very sudden, very radical break. The apple had never been part of the iconographic candidates. All of a sudden it appears and it just demolishes all the others. It just takes over completely. There's no reason for that, or no religious reason. What there is a linguistic reason. I mentioned earlier that the most common Latin word for the forbidden fruit was pomum. You guys remember that slide with a pomum vetitum, the forbidden fruit. So Latin evolves and becomes French. And in Old French, the word pomme means fruit. Just as pomum means fruit in Latin, pomme in French means fruit. It's a general term for fruit. Here's the Old French translation of Genesis, Genesis 1:11, the first chapter of Genesis, when God creates the fruit trees. You can see the underlined words are basically trees bearing fruit. Trees bearing pomme, trees bearing fruit. A generic word for fruit. And here are a few other examples. It doesn't really matter, like the precise detail. Here's the Song of Songs. Your temples behind your veil are like the halves of a pomegranate. And that is translated the pomme with many grains. The pomme with many granules. That's the pomegranate, right? That's actually the palm of pomegranate, is this word, this generic term for fruit. And other examples from Old French, pomme de pin, pine cone, pomme de terre. A lot of examples where the Old French word pomme means fruit. However, we said that malum in Latin means both apple and evil, right? Probably because of that, Old French did not incorporate into its vocabulary a later form of the word malum, apple, from Latin. In other words, there's no Old French word which would be like mal, which means apple. Probably because they didn't want to say, I'd like a pound of evil, or hey, I put some evil in your lunchbox, or something like that. It doesn't sound good. That word never fell into disuse. It stopped being used for apple. It only means evil. Why is that significant? Because the word pomme, over time, began changing its meaning. Rather than being the generic term fruit, it started to narrow its meaning specifically to apple. In other words, there was no other word for apple. The word malum the Latin word malum, did not pass into Old French. And instead, the French word pomum meant fruit, but then started to narrow to mean apple. Like they needed a word for apple. And you can see a few examples in Old French where pomme means apple. I'll just give one quick one. This is the Ordinances of York, which were written in Old French because of the French conquest, or the Norman conquest in 1066. So the ordinance speaks of the pomme, pear, kiris et autres fruitaises, qui le dit fruitière pour verra, the plum and the pears and the cherries and other fruits that said fruit vendor will provide. Clearly, plum is not a generic term for fruit. It's one of a series of types of fruit. The apple, the pears, the cherries, and the other fruit. Is everybody lost at this point? How are we doing? We've covered a lot of ground. We've covered Latin, we've covered art, and now we're covering Old French. All right? So now, what is the point of this? The point is that the word poem in Old French is the standard word that's used for the forbidden fruit. In the translation of Genesis, it says, "For she ate the poem." Or, in this ancient retelling of Genesis, because she ate of a poem, she had the flavor of the poem that was prohibited. Or a play that was put on. Most Christians were illiterate in the Middle Ages, so the church kind of educated them through theater. They had plays that went around to villages, and in these plays, they would perform the fall of man. That was actually the first European play. It's called the Jeu d'Adam, the Adam play, and in it, they talk about, Eve says, "For a poem, I gave up your love," speaking to God. Why is this important? Because the authors of these texts are using the word poem in the Latin sense of pomum, fruit. We saw that it can mean fruit. But at a certain point, once the meaning poem narrows and narrows and narrows and becomes only apple, the readers of these texts, of the Bible, of Genesis, or the people viewing these plays, understand the word poem to mean apple. At that moment, all of these texts, even though the authors didn't mean it in the way that it's understood, even though the authors were trying to say Eve gave Adam a fruit, a poem, the readers and the audience, etc., understand this to be an apple, a poem, which is also the word for apple in modern French. So if you read the Bible in Old French, the language that was accessible to anyone who wasn't, a scholar or learning in the church, something like that, and reading in Latin, you were told that Eve gave Adam an apple. And if you saw the play, you saw that Eve gave Adam an apple. And I'm not going to make this argument for you here right now, but I will tell you that I can show that this change in language occurred in 12th century Paris. In other words, that at that, or in 12th century French-speaking areas, the texts that I have are from Paris, but in other words, this shift where the word poem becomes apple, like the self-evident meaning of poem is apple, occurs exactly when artists begin depicting the forbidden fruit as an apple. They begin doing it in French-speaking areas. Right? So the word poem comes to mean apple. All of these Bible translations that say Eve gave Adam a poem are then, this is not interpretation. They don't understand this as interpretation. It's not theology. It's just how they understand the language. It's just a straightforward thing for them. All of these sources are understood as simply saying the forbidden fruit was an apple, and that's when it appears in the art. The same thing happens with German. I'm just going to do this the word Opfel or Äpfel in Middle High German once meant fruit. Again, we see Genesis 1:11 and the Opfelbaum, the fruit tree. God created the fruit tree of every kind, not specifically an apple, just the fruit tree of every kind. And later it comes to mean apple, which Apfel is what it means in modern German as well as apple. And even though I'm sure most of us are native English speakers, you will be surprised to know that the same thing is true of English. The English word apple used to mean fruit, a generic term fruit. You can see the Wycliffe translation of Genesis 1:11, and God said, the earth bring forth green herb, which is like the grass and making seed, and apple tree, making fruit by its kind. Apple tree does not mean what we mean by apple tree, it just means fruit trees. It just means generic fruit trees. The same shift happens in English and in German. In other words, the word apple, as we know, the word apple is what we understand to mean apple, a single type of fruit. And the same process occurs. Translations that had apple tree or that Eve gave Adam the apple are understood the way we understand it, not the way it was intended. It no longer means fruit, it now means what we mean by apple. And therefore, in the art of England and in the art of Germany, in the art of the Low Countries where this also happens, the apple becomes the dominant fruit. And of course it eradicates all the other fruit, because if you have it in the Bible that Eve gave Adam an apple, why would you represent it as a fig? Why would you represent it as a pomegranate, right? That's it. The debate is over. It's from the Bible. It says that it's an apple. Where does this linguistic change not happen? It doesn't happen in Italy. Because in Italy, the Italian word for apple is mela, was never a generic term, was never the general word for fruit. It never narrows to mean apple, like this whole thing that I'm describing with French and German and English. And so the Italians keep representing it as a fig, as we saw. They just, hundreds of years later, they're still representing it as a fig. It also doesn't happen in Spain. The Spanish word for apple is manzana, had no connection to fruit. It's always been just the apple, end of story, no change. They keep representing it also as a fig and as other fruit, but never as an apple, or not dominantly as an apple. So you can actually do something quite beautiful, which is you can map out the iconographic change, the change in the artistic representation of the apple, and the linguistic change. In places where there was a general term fruit that then came to mean apple, the artist represented it as an apple. France, Germany, England. In places where you don't have that linguistic change, they keep doing it as a fig. That is to say, Italy, Spain, etc. I have in the book an 18th century Slavic picture of Eve giving Adam a grape, a cluster of grapes. They're still using the grapes because they never had that linguistic change, and it never, The final straw for all the other fruit, what absolutely destroys them, is the invention of the printing press. Because all the centers of printing, Germany primarily, but also Switzerland is a big center of printing, England has big centers of printing, those are all apple countries, right? Those are all areas where the apple has become the dominant forbidden fruit. Martin Luther was a big believer in using images to draw people to the Bible. And his editions of the printing of the Bible, which was a huge bestseller, the first bestseller was Luther's Bible. Of course, because Germany was now an apple country, represented Eve picking an apple. From the printing press, the image of the apple was dispersed throughout Europe and beyond Europe, so that it became the self-evident image of forbidden knowledge, sin, and temptation, as we see today, right? Where the apple, the red apple, is just like associated with sin, and that is how the forbidden fruit became an apple. Thank you.
We have time for a couple questions. We'll start. What does the song, when the Song of Songs has the Hebrew word tapuach and it's trying to say apple, what does that mean? And were apples even growing in the land of Israel?
No. So tapuach is the modern Hebrew word for apple. All Bible scholars agree that that does not mean apple. In other words, apples were not cultivated in ancient Israel. Apples have a very interesting agricultural characteristic, which is you have to like slice a branch from the parent tree and graft it onto the sapling for the apple to be, like for the fruits to be the same kind of fruit that came from the parent tree. That technology was not known.
What is a tapuach then?
No one knows. No one knows. My colleague, Gary Rensburg, who's a Bible scholar, thinks that I believe he thinks it's a peach or something that was like round and like nafuach, like inflated as it were, but nobody knows exactly what it is.
If we have, by the way, when we're done, all of my students just stay here and speak to me over here. But any other questions or comments on this fascinating talk? Even if you couldn't follow all the details, I think we got the essence. Yeah.
Professor Shapiro took my question
About the poor. Yeah.
But I just wondered, is your next book going to be the evolution from the book of Jonah as to how it became a whale instead of a big
I hadn't thought of that, but maybe I'll work on that as well. I tend to work on new projects. So when I gave my talk here on my book on Springsteen, everyone said, well, now are you going to write on Dylan or something like that? And the answer was no. So I don't know if I'm going to do another one.
King James Version, I'm not the King James, the Septuagint already in the New Testament refers to it as a whale. But in the Septuagint in the book of Jonah, it's just a big fish.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there went my book.
Yeah, in the play Inherit the Wind, they have that dialogue where
About the nature of the...
I tell everyone when I grew up in my town, there was a store called Jonah's. It was a clothing store, and on the wall it always said, "Always a whale of a sail."
Oh.
I mean, with Pinocchio. That's why we
Right.
think of whales. Okay.
Right. Any questions?
Any questions? Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for coming out, and thank Azzan for driving all the way here from Rutgers. And,
Thank you for inviting me.
We have Jersey people here, but they chose to come to Scranton. We're happy. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.